relevant to them in ways that are, part of who they are. So if you are going to be sharing information, work with local people to help you translate it. Don't use whatever kind of technology that can translate for you, because that will leave out a lot of the nuance. You actually need to work with someone who's going to be able to package the concept in a way that will relate to the lived realities of the people. Then I also think building relationships with local media before, as Melly mentioned, before you need them, just so that they know that you're there. Because if they're going to Google to look for information, if you are already known to them as an expert in this, the chances of them picking up the phone and calling you, or an email and calling you, are higher if they have had engagements with you prior to needing you for a story. And then I think as well, seeing what is happening in communities that is relevant to the research that you're doing. So obviously, I don't think many of you would be studying the South African context, but there are things happening, and going directly to what is on the ground and seeing how it relates to your scholarship or your niche area goes a long way, because it gives you new insights, perhaps a new context to bring into the study. But more importantly, those people then become a voice that you can speak through and speak with about your work. What other countries need to know? Yeah, I think, we've mentioned quite a lot, but on the one hand, although digital media has gained a lot of traction, people still value traditional media in our context. The young people, maybe not as much, but even they still go back to traditional media. So don't think sending a tweet about your work or your insights suffices in these contexts. It does need to find some expression in trusted voices. And yeah, I think I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, I think it can't be emphasized enough that, we've emerged from the era where scientists could sit and be scientists, and there would be well-qualified journalists who would kind of translate their work into the public domain. And I think we can all see that era has passed. And so if you want your work in the realm of SRM to be fairly translated and represented in the public sphere, you have to see being effective public communicators as part of your domain of expertise. And that comes down to the language that's used, as Sisanda has emphasized. It comes down to not being patronizing towards people. And a lot of the arguments and debates that I see on social media around climate issues, particularly in the US, basically seem to boil down to experts calling other people idiots a lot of the time. And it's just not a productive way of conducting these conversations. No matter how ignorant you may feel somebody is, and they may be, calling them an idiot is just not a productive way to keep the conversation going. Or more importantly, and you're not going to persuade that person in that particular context. But the way other people see you speaking to those people and representing your work, and the respect you have or don't have for other people in that domain is really, I think, incredibly important. And then, in respect of our own efforts as Fossil-Free South Africa, we have something called the Climate Reporting Guide for South Africa, which is an attempt to bring together a whole range of issues under the broad domain of climate, and find resources for journalists who are trying to report on these issues, so that they can refer to that for work in the local context. And it would certainly be useful, I think, for us to incorporate a section on SRM in that, and with pointers to whatever local experts there might be. So we'd certainly be open to thinking about that. Thank
you. So we have about 23 3 minutes for questions from the audience. I see there's a few of them already. I see Aliyah and Mark and Patrick in the front, and there's probably some in the back too.
Thanks, and I think a lot of the answer to my question you've touched on, but I just wanted to bring something about disinformation, which is something that we see a lot in this space. And I'm thinking about UNEA, for example. An example of UNEA was environmental groups that came out of the negotiations and simplified information, I would say disingenuously, portraying Africa as a whole as being against SRM, for example. And this is something that was immediately picked up by just about everybody who had anything to say about this resolution on SRM. And it's just very difficult to, I guess my question is, what's a good strategy for organizations who work in this field and who will not have the same kind of legitimacy than, say, an organization that has worked for 20 years in the environmental space and will be seen as more legitimate, but is actually doing something that is not legitimate by missing the nuance on certain issue intentionally to disinform? What's the best strategy for organizations like ours to be able to bring the nuance to the conversation, because we don't want to be attacking these organizations. We don't want to be name blaming. We just want to be able to get another kind of information out there so people can make their own informed decision on what might have actually happened, but we're not being picked up the same way as these organizations have.
So one of the things that I found very useful when I was a journalist, when these big conferences would happen, would be there would be some people who would reach out to our newsroom and say, we're from this entity, we are here for this mining Indaba, whatever the Indaba was. This is what we focus on, this is where we'll be. If you're looking for a comment, whatever, this is where you can find us. And those organizations have probably done that over the years, so they would be uppermost in their minds. But I think when you proactively also get in touch, if you are already at the conference venue or whatever, the conference city, and let the media know, chances are they will get in touch with you, because you are now easy to get hold of. They don't have to look for you. And chances are then, if there is something that you could speak into to correct misinformation, you might be given the opportunity. So I found that useful. So get ahead of the game.
Which page is awesome.
Yeah, just to add on to what Sasanta said. So just this situation is, I had direct engagement with it. So I've thought about it a little bit. One thing I'll say is, there are interests in the world, and some interests are just more powerful than others, and that's just the game, right? And the mainstream environmental interests and climate interests, and I don't mean this in a value judgment way. I just literally are just strong and connected, and their messages will have more visibility. And so it's, I think these are the political dynamics, and then maybe one day so your community will be the Goliath, and you'll remember, and you'll try to be nice to the small people. So I saw some of that coverage, and actually part of why I even entered this whole community is because I reacted because I read this and I was like, I don't know very much about this space, but I actually don't think that this is true. I think that it's probably more complicated. And so then I wrote, I used to have I still do have a standing column in Science, and I wrote about this. This is what pulled me into it, because I felt like I have a different perspective and I lend my voice. And so maybe the lesson for this community is you really need to build bridges and have allies outside, because you're a small community, you're quite insular. You don't have a lot of kind of visibility and political weight. And I mean, I had a bit of a platform. I don't have as big of a platform as the people who have a direct line to the New York Times or whoever. But, I think it's a start to cultivate those allies outside. But that means that you need to stop just talking to yourselves and amongst each other and start to find ways to have emissaries and other people who can kind of add weight, and then it kind of, it's a long game, it's a long political strategy.
Hi. There's so much to talk about here. But so the first thing I'd just like to say is I'd love to meet each and every one of you afterwards, just to have a much longer chat, especially about the basis of trust. But I just wanted to pick up on the vernacular point, if that's the word we're using, or tribal, or whatever. I lived in Kenya for a
Yeah,
while.
actually, when you said indigenous, I was like, that's a word. Sorry.
One? Okay. We actually tried this ourselves. We made a mouse mat for this conference. I don't know if you've got a copy of it, where we tried to translate all of the different SRM methods into Xhosa and Zulu. We worked with some local scientists on that. It was a challenge. No one had done it before, even the people here. And it just struck me as, I'd love to talk about it later, but explore an interesting project. I mean, there's still a lot of competition over the terminology to use in English alone, let alone dozens of different languages. One of the most normative things is the IPCC has a glossary and said, well, this is how we call it, solar radiation modification. Now it's translated in English, French, Spanish, Arabic, Chinese, etc. But I wonder if there could be a project to work together with, I mean, how many vernacular languages are there and which do you pick? Top 2 in each country? I don't know. But Swahili, Luo, Debele, I don't know, where do we go? So, but it would be really fun to do that, to work together. And in doing that, A, you can communicate better, but B, I think it's a real framing exercise. Do we call it reflecting sunlight from the clouds or spraying stratosphere in the atmosphere? You know what I mean anyway. And so I just think it'd be a fantastic project, and I'd love to talk a little bit more about how we go about that. And I think it would help scientists also communicate with their local communities. But the last thing I'd leave is, it's a tough ask. I totally agree, asking scientists to be communicators, great, but you're a scientist, right? You love digging into data and doing your stuff, but and the scientists who can also be communicators also privileges a certain type of person, because there's very few people who can do that. But so in as much as there can be boundary organizations, we, SRM 360, are sort of trying to be a boundary organization, bridging expertise with influences in society, but we can't do the whole world. So in as much as there could be boundary organizations in Africa, in Asia, and I don't know, that seems to be one of the big jobs to be done here. So I'd love to keep on talking with all of you about that and how we could go about that. Thank you. Do you have any comments?
I think with the language, you know, it's not just this area. In so many areas, very recently there was a discussion about astronomy. Like, do we come up with terms first and then? And for me, I have looked at multilingual education in journalism studies. So it's, you know, I do have a position in this debate that the conversation we're trying to feed into is not with scientists. So we don't, at the level of the language, necessarily need to have a fixed term that will then, you know, be the term for ages to come. It's a term, like terms that were developed in COVID, to help people participate in the conversation and understand what is being spoken about. So you will find that when you bring in linguists, they really want to be very precise, and that drags the process on. And, you know, people then move on. So my sense would be that that project would certainly be exciting. It would be quite political, but it is necessary that there does need to be a conversation, especially with, I don't know if this is a new field, I don't know the area, but with things that emerge and that need us to deliberate on them immediately. How do we, as news media, have policies of translation around that? So that I think that could speak to that. And then my response to the second comment, I personally, I'm a social scientist, and I don't think science is complete if it's not communicated to the public. For me personally, that's my position. That if it stays in a journal, you know, that's one layer, but it does need to make its way out there somewhere for it to really be a complete process. So as difficult as it is, it's really something that we need to find ways around, whether it's bringing communicators in on our teams or whatever resourcing we have to do that. It's too important to just say, well, it's too difficult, and leave it at that. It's worth grappling with.
Unfortunately, I'm not going to give you an answer, but if it could be done with the Bible, it can be done with science. It can be, please.
Maybe I'll start quickly with the second one is, and I used to train women scientists from all over Africa in science communication, and it's true, not everyone is designed to be a communicator and has interest or disposition, but we used to say, at a minimum, write a blog about your work in simple language, and even if you never want to ever write another blog, it's just good practice. But first, in that process, we're able to identify the scientists in the group who had a disposition and an interest, and then really help them go further. For everyone else, first, it makes you a better scientist. You really have to think about your problem in a different way. It was just a good exercise. It was good exposure. They wrote like some policy stuff, and not everyone needs or wants to be out engaging with policy, but I think at a minimum, just having that minimum exposure is useful, and then it also helped us identify the people who really wanted to do more and kind of build on that. I think, in terms of language, I once had to give an interview about science in Kiswahili, which I speak, and I just sweated through it. It was horrible. But I really like what you said, because it's really you're not trying to speak scientist to scientist, and that it's really for the people. And like in Kiswahili, we have this panel of people in Zanzibar, old scholars who kind of, I remember it took them a decade to come up with a word for a computer in Kiswahili. I think it's tarakilishi. In the meantime, we just spell computer with a K. I think I found that really interesting, this idea that maybe the goal is not the formal scientific language, but just that simple kind of language. So I'm really going to think about that. That was interesting.
Don't really have a direct answer, but I mean, it is just worth reflecting that I was reading something about Richard Feynman the other day, and the old insight that actually communicating your subject matter to everybody, you learn something new about it yourself in the process of doing so.
So thank you to all of you. Very inspiring remarks. And I want to draw on a few of your remarks and then ask a question of mainly you from the media. But I want to highlight this idea of trust and two-way and starting early with relationships with the media. I'm a casualty of USAID. I've spent my entire career working on environmental policy projects with USAID and engaging media in every country I've worked in. And we were told at some point, you're going to have to pay the media here. And, we couldn't do that in Egypt. It would backfire on us. But I want to highlight some of the points you've made and then pose this question. You're a real systems thinker, and I think that's really important for scientists, because you think systems in your own field, but thinking ecosystems, and all of your talk about the fragmented or the fractured media, but the entire ecosystem around climate is fractured. And so a lot of work we have done over the years is trying to build social capital, build connectivity, build trust among all of the different players across sectors. And media was always a big player for us. We realized that right from the beginning. And in order to get policymakers to the table, we often had to have the media and the celebrities or the influencers that would attract the population, and then the policymakers were usually the last. So we did things like media awards programs in areas that were never done. And that's my question for you is how much have you been and I use the word aggress because you have to not be passive. You don't have to become expert communicators, but you do have to find people who help you communicate with the different elements in the ecosystem. And I'm not just talking about media, but every sector has to be engaged in something like this in order for it to take off. So what have you participated in? And it sounds like you have done things, but like media trainings or awards programs. You see in many countries there are sports awards in the media for those who are reporting best about the sports. But when it comes to a development topic, it's often the donor organizations that are funding these sort of activities. So when the donors go away, it falls away. But for something like SRM to really become better understood and to become a discussion topic, it's going to take an aggressive stance by those of us involved in it, and I'm just the newest here probably to it. But what has happened to you in climate issues? You're coming at this as a scientist, but have people reached out to you to try to get you to own the topic, or to get you? You're not a scientist, but have people tried to educate you and help you own it and get in touch with you early on? You know, when people are thinking in a linear way that, okay, there will come a time when SRM, we can go to the press and then we can start talking more about it. In our experience, it's now to involve them in the decision making so that the press feels the ownership and feels like they have a way. So the question is, how have you been proactively pursued on climate issues? And if you can give some examples of that, that might help others that are trying to get their message out to know ways that they can do it. You've already given a couple of examples.
So personally, when I was a journalist, I can't remember being personally pursued on an individual basis. I know, through press releases, etc. But I do remember managing to get some science stories. They were not about climate, just general science stories onto our news agenda, because UCT at the time was the only university that was sending like a newsletter of sorts that was saying these are some of the interesting projects people are working. There weren't even results yet. It was just scientists doing a project, and that was effective because you got to report on it first, and then as the project progressed and results, emerged, they contacted you or you kept tabs with them. So that I thought worked well. But I think your point about awards is key. That really does motivate journalists to focus on an area. And I don't know if we've got any climate change awards in our context. So that could be something that you look at. Whether you're going to get government or some kind of entity outside a donor agency to do that, I don't think so, for some of the reasons that have been mentioned. But it could start something, that these awards exist, and it gets journalists who are not thinking of the work they do in light of climate to start doing that, and that then becomes sort of a practice for them going forward.
Maybe what I'll say is, because this is still a kind of frontier, new topic, complex, a bit polarized, I think that the field needs to be very politically astute in cultivating. So media, because you could really play into, like, if you're being too aggressive, you really have to time. So I would say at this point in the field's maturity, start with just education, learning experiences for journalists, and then kind of build from there. I think the mainstream climate world, if they don't have journalist awards, they really should, because I think there's really, really interesting reporting on not just climate, but yeah, like the people report on like mining, on this and that, and I think those people really should be. I think that's a great way. I think SRM, there needs to be a bit of some tactics, because you don't want to play into the kind of conspiratorial thinking, and so maybe focus initially on learning experiences, for which makes sense, because there's a lot to learn. We're all kind of trying to figure it out. But I do agree that actually that's a really great a great intervention. Actually, my sister used to be a journalist, and she won an award for covering children's issues, so I'm very proud.
There are a couple of science journalism awards. There's even something called the South African Science Journalists Association, which is quite interesting. And South Africa will be hosting the World Conference of Science Journalists this year.
Okay. I'm very glad that that organization is still existing. Yeah, it's a great, fantastic.
I mean, I'm a bit I mean, we are at the moment trying to get a climate journalism mentoring program off the ground. And part of the proposal that we put together is the idea of very small awards for people in particular realms. I'm quite nervous about the concept of a climate journalism award or an SRM journalism award, because I feel it does push the subject back into a particular silo that we need to get it out of. And so what we're trying to do with a lot of our work is to get journalists across a range of beats to be more confident and capable when it comes to talking about climate. Because the idea that climate change is just something that belongs in the environment section is a very, very dangerous one.
Yeah, I was struck by your observation that climate gets put in this science box, and you could see that the same thing would happen for SRM when really it's about a lot more. We have 2 minutes. Shin, is your question quick?
Yeah, thank you so much. I just want to ask about the idea of the dog whistling and public outrage in social media, because I just come across the idea this is dog whistling. So, like particularly like the political like activists and particularly like right-wing populists, and then they use like mundane languages, but speaking specific segment of like in the publics and try to create an outrage and then mobilizing like some like very like actions on targeting some people. I heard that's the quite things in U.S. and North America, but also it's happening. I can come from Japan. It's also Japan, many right-wing populists using these kind of ideas, and I feel like most of publics when I hear about SRM, probably they just scroll out and then they don't pay much attention about it, but some small segment of people might be mobilized and then like using name calling or dog whistling. Like, is that the things also happening in South Africa or now African countries? Or I just wanted to hear about that.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Dog whistling. Anybody have a quick answer to that? Experience with it?
I don't know. I do know, though, that there has been a recent practice, particularly on X, where these echo chambers are deliberately being created in other respects. So people to try and really feel outrage on a topic or against someone who's posted something it would seem like a lot of organic engagement when it's actually people who know each other or people who are linked. And that, I think, is something that the Daily Maverick today, I think they put out a video, which is quite interesting, that you can maybe look out for, on how that looks in respect to some of the recent, I think, a group of Afrikaners who've gone to the US, etc. But they've got an interesting video where one of the journalists talks about this outrage that happens online in those kind of conversations and how it's fueled by these echo chambers that are not organic. They are deliberately being created offline and then they manifest online to pretend as though it's like a public thing when it's actually a few people.
Is there a name for that phenomenon yet?
Your definition's not.
I will think of it.
Yeah, you could write a paper. It's kind of like digital astroturfing. I don't know.
Yeah, so I don't know about dog whistling specifically in this context, but yeah, there's a lot of, like I said, disinformation. There's a lot of weird phenomena that we should be aware of because it's like a tricky topic. It's like we're kind of on a knife edge. One thing I know that's happening that is adjacent in climate is now when terms and ideas are being repurposed, and so people on the right who are maybe don't prioritize climate. And you said this too, but it's happening like so. When I used to work on energy poverty, and we used to talk about energy for growth or abundance or whatever. We were using terms that are now kind of being used, and like now everybody has their own vision of energy abundance. In some ways, it could be used in a way that has moved away from the original intention, or is a way to a vehicle to basically communicate anti-climate or pro-fossil. I think in this space, it's something that we need to watch out for, because different people with different interests might start to co-opt the language. And I don't know if it'll necessarily be in a particular dog whistling format, but I think that co-opting is something we have to watch out for.
So unfortunately, we have barely scratched the surface of all of this. But I just want to say, I reached out cold to these 3 local experts, just sending an email, will you please come and share your knowledge with this group? And you did, and I'm just so grateful for you to take time out of your day to share what you know with us and have this conversation. Truly, please join me in thanking this panel.